So this is David Sanchez, the Director of Ethics and Justice. I'm here with Katie Swafford and Katie Fruget. Katie Swafford, could you introduce yourself to us? We all know Katie Fruget. She's our Hunger and Care Director at the CLC.
Sure. Thanks, David. My name is Katie Swafford. I'm the Director of Counseling Services with Texas Baptist. I'm a licensed counselor, have been for about 20 years in the state of Texas, and came to Texas Baptist as the Director of Counseling Services almost 10 years ago now.
And today we're talking specifically about trauma and the effects of trauma. And it's really interesting because before we pressed record, I recounted to you a story that made me think about how trauma can have a long-lasting impact. And you said, yeah, but David, don't share that story, because if you go into the details about that story, that actually could bring back, like, it could be a trigger for certain people. And then Katie had a question based off of that comment. Katie?
Yeah, I was just curious about the very concept of triggering. When we're talking about ministering with people who have lived through traumatic experiences, there's this new buzzword that I've heard so much in more like social media and mainstream culture, this idea of triggering. And so I was asking you if that's a clinical term or how should we navigate that understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I when I think back to training, CEUs, all the things that I've done over the years, I really can't say that I ever remember seeing trigger terminology, quote unquote, as a psychology term that is used frequently. Now, I will say culturally, I think we probably use it a lot, and somewhere along the way, we've come to understand what that means. And so there's that common definition that we understand what each other means when we use that terminology. And in case anyone doesn't, what we mean by that is when you use the word trigger to talk to someone about, does that trigger you? Or as David mentioned, not sharing a story because he didn't want to trigger someone. What that means is just for someone to have certain expressions, behaviors that a word, a comment, a look, a story, a detail can cause to kind of rise up within them from their past experiences, from a past traumatic experience. So the trigger terminology, although somebody can easily correct me, but I've never seen that as being designated a specific clinical term, but certainly culturally, I think we use that to understand and help to communicate with each other, you know, hey, this is a sensitive subject.
And I would add to that that oftentimes it's used online in a very rude way, in like a demeaning way. But if I just try and put myself in those shoes, I remember one time going to the movie theater to watch a movie, and at the very beginning of the movie, there was kind of this montage of a mom with her daughter who was born with a terminal illness, and to use that word, it triggered me because it brought up my own daughter who passed away after only being with us for about 14 hours. And suddenly I was dealing with all of these emotions that I wasn't prepared for in the middle of this theater, and came close to having a panic attack. And so I think it's just helpful for us to remember, you know, when there's a real person with real emotions and real history behind, we've got to be a little bit more sensitive, maybe even in using that word.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, you know, you talk about when there's people around us. I think it's one thing if there are people around you that you know a little bit more about their story, their history, etc. In some of our ministry contexts, particularly in church, you may not know a lot about that particular individual's history unless you're in a small group with them. So I think in general, it's probably just wise of us to be kind of on our own guard about how we use terminology, just to try to be sensitive to others and not put them in uncomfortable or awkward situations if we don't have to.
Yeah, that's a good word. But what originally I brought you here for, until we started with a rabbit trail, was, as we all know, there was a hostage situation this past Saturday at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, and 4 people were held hostage. And I remember, you know, it became like the dominant story in media and on social media, and people all over were calling for prayers. And then once the situation was resolved, and we're very thankful that all 4 of the hostages, you know, survived and got out of that situation. It was like, yay, it's done. And I just stopped and thought, no, isn't it just starting? If you were one of those 4 people, if you were one of the people who knew those 4 people, if you were a friend or a family member who went through this, and it just made me want to ask you as a counselor, what are the effects of trauma? Like, what is it going to do to people like that who go through an experience like that? Because it's not over for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate perspective too. One of the things that I would say, blanket statement wise, is trauma affects everyone differently. So it's even though we have diagnostic criteria to kind of help us identify what exactly post-traumatic stress disorder might look like and things like that, trauma can be received and feel different ways to different people and be expressed differently. So I would say that as kind of a blanket statement. And then the other thing I would say more general too is that what's really interesting, and we're not going to be able to kind of peek behind the curtain, so to speak, what happens next for those individuals that were involved in that, but every one of them can have a completely different response. And for some of them, it could be very debilitating in some ways. They could have a lot of re-experiencing the trauma, flashbacks, those types of things that a lot of anxiety, vigilance, etc., hypervigilance. But it's very possible that one of those individuals may go through that entire ordeal with a pretty calm sense of being and not experience those residual effects of trauma that oftentimes we think about. So you can't just assume that because someone has been through a traumatic experience that it is going to result in nightmares, hypervigilance, some of these different things that we think about with regard to trauma. It's so interesting. And then there's complex trauma, things that can compound one on top of the other. They have the experience in that particular situation while they were in the church setting, or the synagogue setting rather. And then there could have been potentially, I hope not, but potentially even in the rescue and the release of the hostages and how they were received outside. There's potential there could have been secondary trauma that happened on top of the first trauma. We don't know because we're obviously not specific and privy to all the information that they're going through and haven't talked to them. But anyone, just generally speaking, who goes through a trauma, the three of us could be in a car accident, which could be traumatic, and each of us could walk away with very different experiences and very different expressions of how that has impacted us. And one of us could walk away and totally be fine, and one of us could walk away and have weeks and months of debilitating nightmares. We can't sleep, we're afraid to get in a car, all sorts of symptoms after that.
That brings me, or just makes me think of a follow-up question to that, Katie. If we all experience trauma, I'm even thinking about the last 2 years collectively as a nation, as a world, we have experienced trauma, and we're all experiencing it in different ways and unique expressions. Could you speak to how to know or how to navigate when you might need a little bit more support than just a community base? When do we know this really is extending beyond something that I'm capable of, and we really need to go to the next level of support and helping someone as they're processing trauma, as so many of us have over the last 2 years?
Mm-hmm. So what I would say, there's kind of two questions I heard in there, and I'm going to try to address both of them. One of them being, how do I know for myself? So if I go through a trauma, I go through an event of some sort and come out on the other end of it, and maybe not even for the first couple of weeks, but maybe later on, I start to notice that I'm more anxious than I was before. I'm not sleeping as well. Maybe my eating habits change. And that could be immediately after the event. It could be several months after the event. Sometimes as we continue to kind of process that trauma, it expresses itself in different ways, and these different types of things pop up. It could even be something where all of a sudden you start to notice that your digestive system is not working very well anymore. You're really nervous a lot, and it's affecting your digestive system. Headaches. There's so many different types of symptoms. And as you start to notice those things, hopefully if that's a new symptom for you, over a period of time might go, this is kind of developing to be a pattern, or I notice it specifically when I go to this particular place, or when I'm with this particular person or this particular environment. If you start to notice some patterns, then that would be one identifying factor that maybe there's a little bit more going on here that I need to seek out some help. Certainly if you get to the place where it's debilitating and impacting your everyday function, not showering, not being able to go to work, not being able to go out, purchase groceries, or take your kids to school, or whatever those circumstances might be. Or if it's a young child, they're getting really sick a lot, not wanting to go to school, not being able to function in those ways. So absolutely, if it gets to the place where it's affecting your daily function, and certainly over a period of a couple of weeks, but I would say if you notice it, just start to pay attention, and that might be a good time to seek out some help. Now, as far as when you're observing that in someone else, maybe you have a spouse, a friend that you know has gone through a trauma, and maybe you start to see some of these patterns, but they haven't identified them. I think that's an opportunity for you to just have, particularly if you have a good relationship with them, to just say, hey, I'm observing these things. I just noticed you didn't seem to do that before. Are you okay? Start to ask some questions. How do you think, have you noticed them? Do you think maybe it might be a good idea to seek the help of someone who would be a trusted individual counselor, mental health professional, whomever, physician, to be able to kind of walk alongside and help to identify the areas that maybe you're struggling a little bit in and don't even realize. So just being a sounding board for them to highlight some observations. It's probably not going to do the best thing to say, kicking, dragging, and screaming taking you to a mental health professional. That's probably not the best way to go about it. But but just have a compassionate response and kind of reflect back to them. This is what I'm observing, and just have a conversation.
I guess my last question then would be, with all that in mind, and thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. How can we be praying for people who we know have been through a traumatic event? How can we continue praying for the synagogue after the hostage situation?
Yeah, I think if you're someone who has access to this individual that you think might have experienced a trauma, one of the most impactful things you can do, along with prayer, is to just be present. And that doesn't always have to mean that you are verbally saying anything to them. Sometimes that might mean you just go say, hey, let's just go have a cup of coffee and sit somewhere, and we don't have to talk. I just want to be here with you for someone who's gone through a traumatic experience. And sometimes that is extremely, extremely helpful. But with regard to praying for, I think depending on how close or far away you are from the situation, praying that the Lord will place people of comfort, of support, of encouragement in their lives, praying that the Lord will heal their hearts and their minds for whatever things they might be experiencing, whether that's the anxiety or hypervigilance, nightmares, trouble sleeping, whatever it might be. Just praying that the Lord will be able to touch them in those ways and comfort them. And certainly praying that the Lord would give them courage to be able to seek out the help that they need. The Lord is absolutely 100% capable of, in a snap of a finger, at his word, at his blink, he can make something happen. And we know that, and deliverance and healing is possible. But sometimes that comes through a process. And sometimes that comes through other instruments of healing and grace in our lives, like mental health professionals or trusted congregate members, small group leaders, people who can just be there and support us. So sometimes there's some really cool things to learn in that process, although it does not feel like it at all in that stage. So that's where just having that individual to stand alongside and be supportive can be helpful. But I think those are some of the key things that you can pray for, whether it's someone that's close to you or even from a distance. There's opportunities to pray for the Lord to be able to surround those individuals with the appropriate care that they need to be able to come to any terms of healing and or to be able to move forward in healthy patterns for the future.
It just reminds me so much, just the beautiful truth that the Lord has created us for one another, that he created us to be loved and to be known. And as we experience the realities of living in a fallen world, trauma is a part of that. And I think it's just a beautiful testimony that we, even in our trauma, need one another. And that's a part of the healing process, is going through it with each other. So I just think that's really beautiful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. It helped me personally, and I hope it's helpful to others as well who watch this.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. And the last thing that I would just like to say is we're talking about a very specific event that all of us were kind of witness to, but there are so many traumas that happen early in life. There are so many things that have happened to many of us along the path, and we may not realize later down the road how they're affecting us and impacting us. So just being aware of, as those who are in ministry context and relationship with each other, Katie, exactly like you said, God created us for a relationship. That's where healing occurs. And so being able to engage in those patterns of relationship in healthy ways so that we might recognize and be able to support someone through a traumatic experience that may have happened many, many years ago, and doesn't have to necessarily be something that was all across the media or that the nation saw. So, yeah.
So true. Thank you.